Stop, the 1970s, dead zone, they erased from history. Look, I'm gonna tell you something most people were never meant to hear. In the mid-70s, a deep-sea dead zone started taking 3-minute breaths, oxygen up, oxygen gone, then the files vanished. Ships kinked their routes, labs got quiet, and a memo called it instrument error. One problem, the Navy rerouted anyway. Trust me, you're not ready. What I'm about to show you ties POLYMODE's rim transects to famous dives on the mid-Atlantic ridge, and to money that moved the map. 3 pillars hold it up: the signal clash, the resource gag, and the textbook scrub. Once you see this, there's no going back. The Vanishing Decade. The ocean was supposed to be slow. That's what the book said. Oxygen minimum zones sit like deserts, tidy and dull. But in the 1970s, the water twitched, and people with budgets to protect twitched faster. Picture this: peak Cold War. Americans and Soviets running joint cruises, smiling on deck, reporting to separate rooms at night. POLYMODE chasing internal waves and eddies, ocean weather most folks never see. Famous crawling the mid-Atlantic ridge in little subs, staring straight into the Earth's split lip. On paper, open science. In practice, every cast doubled as intel. Then the edge coughed. Right where dead water leans against a ridge shoulder, oxygen twitched up for minutes, not months. First read, a hiccup. Second cast, different sensor, same beat. Winkler bottles came back just high enough to matter. Too clean for noise, too fast for comfort. Get this, the signal hugged the rim and vanished off it like the slope itself was keeping time. On deck, it smelled like wet cable and burned coffee. A grad student taped the ugly spike to the bulkhead. Someone muttered biofouling, wiped the membrane, ran it again. Same pulse. You could feel the room tilt. This wasn't a cute anomaly. It messed with fleets, leases, and math. Because if dead water breathes at the edge, fish can stack in windows nobody mapped. If redox flips that fast, metals move, microbes sprint, and corrosion clocks rewrite themselves. Carbon budgets that assume smooth starvation suddenly hiccup. That's fisheries, climate, seabed mining, and submarine acoustics, all in one 3-minute rise. 4 reasons to care, 4 reasons to make it disappear. Meanwhile, famous divers, far from known vents, started bringing up basalt with pale films and a soft sulfur smell. Not a roaring smoker, just faint hints of electrons trading hands where textbooks said they shouldn't. Trace metals twitched with the oxygen, manganese up with the breath, down with the fade. Internal waves with a clean pitch, long ghosts pushing tongues of oxygen down the slope on a clock. It fit the timing perfectly, which made it worse. Clean patterns force hard choices. Here, where the human part cuts deep. Reviewers praised rigor, then stalled. Meeting minutes learned a new phrase: national relevance. A QA note slid through POLYMODE. High oxygen excursions reclassified as instrument artifacts. If that's true, explain the fleet desk quietly bending a training box around that same rim 3 days later. If the meters lied, why did the ships move? Inside the lab, loyalties split. One camp wanted to publish the safe stuff and keep funding. The other said smoothing spikes is just lying politely. A young tech started copying deck logs at night, practice reels labeled like junk, because junk doesn't get audited. He wasn't chasing headlines. He just didn't want the ocean erased by a memo. The purge wasn't loud. It was a slow eraser. A station number dropped from a neat list, 41, then 43. A figure reissued with a stretched axis and a rounded shoulder where a tooth used to be. Microfilm in one library showed the twitch. The updated reel across the country didn't. Call it cleanup if you're generous. Call it control if you've ever watched a budget meeting. Are you sitting down? Because the edge breath showed up everywhere except in print. Fishermen working the rim hit 20-minute pockets that paid the mortgage, then took fines for crossing lines drawn on dead maps. Cable layers whispered about shock corrosion, runs no storm could explain. Navy acousticians trained for sensor shock events near the boundary, a beige phrase for don't trust your math when the rim inhales. To understand why this mattered, remember who lives there. Subs need stable layers to stay quiet. Cables need steady chemistry to stay whole. Rigs need coatings that don't age 10 years in a week. If the edge flips fast, you time your work or you bleed money. That's the entire market, right there, learning a clock the textbooks refused to print. One crew's log survived the smoothing. Smudged times. Repeat same probe, same, scribbled in the margin. It's not a smoking gun, it's a door. You see who was in the room the moment the language changed, and the day the track kinked around a polygon that didn't exist yesterday. The decade didn't vanish because nobody looked. It vanished because looking too close made powerful people solve expensive problems in public. So here's our map. 3 pillars. The signal clash, pulses the model couldn't hold, verified, then renamed noise. The Resource Gag, roots bent, leases hugged the rim, insurers invented sensor events, and navies trained in boxes that draped the breath. The textbook scrub, spikes shaved to shoulders, QA bullets teaching students to delete the seam before they ever saw it. Together, they turned a living edge into a tidy desert. This rabbit hole goes deeper. A cruise that slipped the index. A reroute pattern nobody explained. A corrosion patent that quietly admits the pulse. We'll separate what's documented from what we infer, and we'll show the exact beat where ships changed course and figures changed shape. Trust me, once you hear the clock, every smooth map starts to look like a lie told politely. The first signal, oxygen lies. They were back on station at dawn because nobody slept. The cabin smelled like burnt coffee and wet rope, and the sea looked like hammered slate. The CTD slid through the thermocline, bottles cocked, screens humming. The oxygen trace sagged just like the textbooks promised, and then it twitched, not a wobble. A clean 3-minute rise. 10 meters later, it did it again. Too crisp for noise, too brief to be a layer, no speeches, just a quiet, run it again. Redundancy was their religion, so they swapped the sensor, changed brands, polished membranes until they squeaked. They hung a Winkler bottle to check the chemistry in glass. Second drop, same depth, same clock. 3-minute breath right on time. The Winkler came back a hair higher than the downcast mean, just enough to matter, not enough to publish without a fight. Someone said biofouling. The tech shook his head. Membrane spotless. Numbers refused to move where the excuse pointed. They slid 30 miles along the contour like they were tracing a scar. The pulse followed the rim. Inside, the dead core flat as a table. On the shoulder, the line climbed, held, and dropped like a metronome. Off the slope, gone. The shape of the seafloor was keeping time. You could feel the lab breathe in, then hold it. Back in the wet lab, the metals started singing the same song. Manganese ticked up the instant oxygen rose, then fell when it faded. Iron chased a dirtier echo, quick hands grabbing and letting go. Redox doesn't flip for fun. Either a tongue of oxygen-rich water was sliding down the wall, or microbes were waking like a switch. The chemist whispered, "Too fast," and it wasn't doubt. It was grief for the ocean he'd been taught. Arguments got short and sharp. If the sensor was wrong, both brands failed together and the bottles lied with them. If the ocean was wrong, the global model was a cartoon. You don't say that on a POLYMODE deck unless you like losing ship time. A note slid across the bench. Vent proximate influence. Safe words for something happening miles from any mapped vent. The internal wave crew had the clean pitch. Picture a slow, invisible swell twisting the boundary. When it crests, it drags a tongue of surface-breathed water down the slope for a few minutes, then lets go. A pump with no pistons. It matched the timing. It hugged the rim. It turned an ocean desert into a lung that moved on a schedule you could miss between coffee and lunch. 2 labs drafted a tight note. Repeats, dual sensors, Winklers, no adjectives. They didn't get peer review. They got a call. Quality assurance clarifications. Same beige voice that tells you your passport is under review. A POLYMODE memo followed. Classify high-oxygen excursions as instrumental artifacts due to transient flow. On deck, the grad student taped the spiky printout to the bulkhead with gray tape. The PI peeled it off and slid it into a folder labeled Practice. Practice is for calibrations, not for a seam that breathes. FAMOUS had its own side puzzle. Divers came back from off-axis runs with basalt frosted in pale films, faint sulfur on the air, nowhere near a black smoker. Mats where mats didn't belong. If microbes were riding those pulses, this was their ledger. No headline, just a smell that nagged. They built a careful conference poster. Stacked profiles, flat, twitch, flat. A dotted trace hinting at phase, corner box with Winklers blipping up during the breath. A naval liaison stopped, smiled politely, asked for a copy. 2 weeks later, their ship time vanished for portfolio balance. Meanwhile, a fleet advisory bent a training box around the same rim for acoustic stability. If the meters lied, why did steel move? The team split down the middle. Publish safe, protect the program. Or keep the spike, tell the truth, risk the calls. The tape tech, the gray tape kid, started making midnight copies of deck logs and raw reels, labeling them practice because junk avoids audits. He wasn't leaking. He was future-proofing the truth. They chased the engine. A mooring they'd left on the rim came back alive. Oxygen riding the same beat. Temperature and current swaying like matched dancers. The edge breathed when the internal wave crested, exhaled when it passed. A structure, not a glitch. That's when the stakes stopped being theory. Fish would stack on those windows and vanish after. Close a line the wrong way, you starve boats. Open the wrong patch, you crush the only refuge the stock still uses. Decomposers would sprint during the breath, chewing carbon that models booked as locked. Add that up along 1,000 kilometers of edge, and your tidy budget hiccups into a different number. Metals would pit on the upbeat and sleep on the down. Cables, rigs, coatings. Timed failures if you pretend the clock isn't there. They prepped a bone-dry methods note. Dual sensors, phase match, winklers, mooring confirmation. Review came back with one sentence that curdled the room. Reframe with unconventional behavior. Remove transients as noise. The modeler stared like the code had betrayed him. The grad student wrote in a notebook, "If it breathes and we call it noise, who are we for?" Then came the clean debunk. A rival crew sailed months later with a slow response sensor that smears anything under 10 minutes into a polite shoulder. Their plot was gorgeous. Their conclusion, no episodic oxygenation observed. Their sponsor list hummed with metals money. On a whiteboard, someone wrote, "Use a sundial, miss the hummingbird." Meanwhile, the helm logs nobody sanitized showed a speed dip and a coarse kink right where the breath beat hardest. Weather was calm. Instruments were not. Maps in classrooms stayed straight. Ships at sea did not. They didn't solve the mystery that week. They proved it existed and learned its mood. The RIM inhaled on a clock. The labs called it artifact. The Navy called it stability. The cable teams called it scheduling. The fishers called it Tuesday. And the ocean, stubborn as ever, just kept breathing. 3 pillars roadmap. Look, I'm going to tell you something that's going to pay off the rest of the way. If you can hold 3 ideas in your head, the map stops lying. We call them the signal clash, the resource gag, and the textbook scrub. You felt pieces already on that deck: coffee, wet rope, the gray tape spike. But now we lay the tracks so you can see the moves before they happen. First, the signal clash. This is the ocean talking and the pipeline arguing back. On the rim, oxygen rose for 3 clean minutes, then fell. Dual sensors caught it, winklers nudged with the beat, and a mooring rode the same clock through the night. Temperature, currents, and trace metals swayed in phase. It wasn't drama, it was structure. The clash came when quality assurance renamed it an artifact. The code learned to sand the breath flat, and clean figures got published while ships quietly bent around polygons that weren't on any public chart. Stakes, real people. Fish stacking in breath windows their permits deny. Cable teams timing splices like heart surgeons. Carbon math wobbling while models pretend seasons are smooth. The clash isn't chemistry versus electronics. It's truth versus a workflow that hates spikes. Second, the resource gag. This is steel and money learning the clock while pretending they don't. After those pulses showed up, route advisories bloomed along the rim with beige reasons: training, systems checks. Insurance riders grew a new phrase: sensor events. Cable memos mapped stability corridors that hugged the slow half of the breath. Mining scouts planted flags on shoulders, not centers, pitching enhanced boundary productivity while coatings quietly aged in dog years. Navies wrapped exercise boxes over the same edges for acoustic stability, which is sailor speak for don't trust your math when the layer flips. None of them said oxygen. Didn't need to, they priced it. The gag doesn't require a villain, it needs shared incentives. If a 3-minute breath-dense stealth pits sheaths and spins nodules, you reroute, reschedule, and rename. Public maps stay pretty. Private calendars move on the drum. Third, the textbook scrub. This one lives in margins and axes. Early drafts showed the tooth at the boundary with timid captions: possible episodic oxygenation. Committees blessed QA bullets, spikes became instrument artifacts. Final plates stretched the axis until the tooth rounded into a shoulder. Lecture slides taught students to flag jumps, smooth hard, and avoid overinterpreting transients. Code inherited the lesson, defaulted to filters, and drew the ocean it expected. Librarians swapped microfilm where one reel kept the twitch and another wore it down. A rival debunk sailed with slow ears, missed the hummingbird, and got canonized as clarity. That's how you train a generation to erase a seam before they've ever seen it. Here's how the pillars lock. Signal clash proves the beat is real, replicates, winklers, mooring, phase. Resource gag explains why the truth goes mute. Money hates unplanned clocks. Textbook scrub makes the silence durable, slides and software that flatten the world. Together, they turn a live wire into a study aid and send anyone who listens back to the rim like a contrarian. Micro stories keep you honest. A helm log shows a coarse kink on a calm day. A fish tote lands heavy for 20 minutes, then goes dead. A repair chief stalls a splice until telemetry stops pulsing. A corrosion spec adds short boundary excursions without saying why. A student toggles a filter and watches sawteeth appear where the atlas promised glass. None of those people need the word oxygen. They need the window. Trust me, you're not ready for how the receipts line up when we follow them. We've got a cruise station that vanished between 41 and 43, a reroute pattern that mirrors internal wave phase, and a corrosion filing that quietly bakes the breath into coatings. We'll mark what's documented and what we infer, and we'll keep the humans in frame. Text duplicating reels, clerks microfilming, temporary guidance, skippers drawing pencil pockets on dead maps. Once you hear the rim's clock, you can't unhear it. The smooth chart breaks first in your head, then on paper, then under steel. The next beat is where the paper trail blinks. The signal clash, chemistry that shouldn't exist. Look, I'm gonna tell you something simple first. The sea handed them a metronome and the paperwork tried to smash it. They parked on the rim with a repeat station, same latitude, same depth, because that's where the gray-taped spike first bit. The first downcast eased into the oxygen minimum like the Atlas promised, then rose clean for 3 minutes like a held breath. The upcast echoed a soft version of the same move, which mattered because upcasts usually smear noise. Echo means structure. Redundancy wasn't a slogan, it was survival. They ran dual oxygen sensors from different makers on the frame and clipped an older, trusty cell on a separate wire. All three heard the lift within seconds of each other. Then the bottles came up from that depth, Winkler titrations nudging higher right on the window. Not a trumpet blast, more like a footstep in a quiet hall, but in phase with the spike. The kind of rise you can't publish without a war, but you also can't forget. They tested the rim itself like a rail. Steering the ship along the contour, they kept station with the sloped shoulder, and the pulse followed like a shadow. Slide off the wall and it vanished. Sit on the shoulder and it snapped back into time. Inside the dead core, the trace went flat as a hospital beep. On the lip, 3 up, 10 down, repeat. Even the current meter pulsed with it, like the room's lights kept brightening and dimming on a schedule. Back in the lab, trace metals joined the chorus. Manganese spiked the instant oxygen rose and fell when it faded. Iron chased the same dance with a slight lag, dirty from quick grabs and releases. Redox doesn't spin that fast unless you change the air or wake something hungry. The chemist rubbed his eyes and whispered, "Too fast," and then started swapping reagents like a man trying to rule out denial. Here's where the human tells give the game away. A Soviet colleague tapped the plot with a nicotine-stained finger and said, "Wave," like he was naming a cousin. He'd seen a shelf in the Black Sea bite back on storms, short, mean breaths that made and broke fisheries in hours. The American pie nodded and in the same motion asked him not to say it in the joint summary. That's a wall you feel, not one you see. Meanwhile, a mooring they'd left to babysit the rim came back with the ocean's diary. Oxygen, temperature, salinity, and current vectors rode the same long internal wave beat all night. No deck handling, no cable chatter, just the deep writing in clean ink. When the wave crested, oxygen rose and the current folded toward the slope. When it troughed, everything exhaled. You don't get that from a sticky membrane. Now stakes. Fish live on seconds when maps pretend seasons. If the rim inhales, schools sprint into that window, feed, and fall out again. Close the wrong side of that line and you starve boats while pretending to save them. Carbon's worse. Decomposition in low oxygen water crawls. Give it a breath and it runs. Multiply 3-minute sprints by 1,000 kilometers of rim and you tilt budgets that power policies. Metals hurt fastest. Every upbeat chews coatings, wakes microbes that eat steel, and wipes months off a cable in a single night. The modeler tried to stuff this truth into a pipeline built to fear teeth. The auto-filters flagged the upflicks as outliers, binned them, and redrew the cast as a respectable shoulder. He widened the window, the spike came back angrier. He smoothed harder, it hid as a bulge the ship never actually saw. That's how you sand the world until it's polite. That's also how you lie without intending to. They wrote the driest methods note of their lives. Dual sensors, independent cell, Winklers, mooring phase match, internal wave timing. No adjectives, no claims beyond. It repeats. The reply arrived in that beige voice every field scientist learns to dread. Reframe within conventional behavior, remove transients as noise, coordinate interpretations before circulation. Translation, flatten the breath and mail us the ashes. Get this, while the memo warmed the copier, the helm logged a slowdown and a small course kink right where the rim's beat was loudest. Weather, calm, sea, glass, reason scribbled in the margin, ops. Unknown to the deckhands, a naval advisory had just bent a box over that same contour for acoustic stability. The meters were wrong officially. The steel disagreed. A rival lab sailed months later with a sensor designed to miss hummingbirds. Low response, low noise, very sponsor-friendly. Their figure was smooth as a brochure. Conclusion, no episodic oxygenation. The metal's foundation at the bottom of their acknowledgments glowed like a lighthouse. In a break room far away, a tech wrote, "If you choose the slow ear, you won't hear the drum," and pinned it beside the coffee maker. Meanwhile, famous side dives brought back basalt with pale films and a faint sulfur hello far from any mapped vent. No press release. Just a smell and a microscope note. Mats where mats shouldn't be. The kind of clue that makes you stare at the rim and wonder if microbes time their lives to a clock your pipeline calls an error. This is where everything clicks or cracks. The signal clash isn't mystical. The ocean breathed on a schedule you can mark with a pencil. Hardware agreed. Chemistry agreed. A mooring agreed without human hands touching it. The only thing that didn't agree was the pathway from deck to figure. And that pathway had learned a habit: protect clarity, punish teeth. Trust me, you're not ready for what happens when habits meet proof. The ship's next posted line arrived curved. The grant language went beige. A QA slide for new leads landed with 3 bullets. Flag jumps, smooth, hard, avoid overinterpretation. In classrooms, the shoulder replaced the tooth. Out at sea, a repair chief stared at pitted sheath and waited for a window only a liar would call noise. So the signal clash stands. 3 minutes up, 10 down, repeat. Internal waves drag breath along a live wire. Fish stack, metals flip, carbon sprints, sonar bends. The deep isn't flat or slow. It inhales. And the only honest thing left to ask is who decided the breath didn't belong on the page and why their maps still kink when it shows up. Evidence trail, the crews that vanished. 3 days after the mooring sang, the paper trail started to get jumpy. The transect log looked like piano keys, 41, 42, 43, except the typed table suddenly skipped the middle note. Station 42 was gone. The deck book still had a dawn cast penciled in with sloppy gloves, but the official bundle printed a clean line through empty water. On the master chart, a faint X hid under a thumb smear of eraser gloss right where the rim was loudest. Unknown to the science team, a clerk across town picked up a polite call from a naval liaison. New process, they said. Anomaly tagged, casts would be held for QA before release. It sounded boring on purpose. She stamped hold on a manila folder and slid it into an unlabeled drawer. That drawer would start swallowing more folders than anyone admitted. Back on the ship, the gray tape grad found a cardboard box under the bench stamped practice. Lab policy said raw duplicates don't get archived, so practice was how you made them invisible. Inside sat 7 magnetic reels, each scrawled with station numbers, one with a shaky 42. He threaded the tape, listened to the hiss, and watched header tones locked to the ship clock. Depth ladder slid clean, then there it was, the same 3-minute rise in phase with the internal wave beat. Practice, my ass. Meanwhile, the helm log that nobody thought to sanitize showed a speed dip and a tiny course kink right where 42 should have been. Weather, calm, sea, glass, reason, ops. You don't slow a research vessel on a flat day unless someone told you that patch bites back. The printed cruise track later showed a perfect straight line through that spot, like the ocean had been ironed after the fact. 3 days earlier, a letter on heavy paper had landed in the Pi's mailbox. Until variances were resolved, further work in those coordinates wasn't advised due to clearance implications. That phrase didn't belong anywhere near a Winkler bottle. He folded the letter twice, tucked it into a book, and told the team to prioritize core objectives. Translation: steer off the rim. Parallel stories kept leaking through human hands. A rival lab rushed a no pulses here note using a famously sluggish oxygen sensor that smears anything under 10 minutes into a polite shoulder. Their figure was gorgeous, their conclusion tidy, and their sponsor list ended with a metals foundation. In a break room 2 floors down, a tech taped a handwritten line to the kettle. Use the slow ear, miss the drum. Cross an ocean, a shipping circular put a beige advisory box over the same rim. Transient sensor degradation possible. No reason listed. Same week, an oil major extended its reconnaissance window for operational efficiencies along that shoulder. Fishermen working the edge scribbled "good pocket" in pencil on charts they never showed to inspectors. 20-minute hauls, then dead again, like the sea was breathing around a metronome only the boats could hear. The archive hardened around the gap. The national database accepted the clean tables without raw spikes, citing smooth to consensus. One university's microfilm still flashed the tooth. Another's glossy substitute wore a rounded shoulder. Errata listed typos, never axes. Temporary QA guidance memo. No accession number appeared in minutes, not catalogs. You can call that sloppiness. Stack enough sloppiness in one direction, it starts to look like policy. Get this, months later, a cable seminar in a windowless room rolled a slide labeled shock corrosion incidents. The failure histogram thrummed with that same 3-minute beat. The presenter didn't say oxygen, he didn't have to. His fix was a coding spec tuned for short boundary excursions. Different building, same clock. Even the scientist's own house wasn't safe. A training packet for new QA leads landed with 3 bullets. Flag high oxygen jumps, apply standardized smoothing, avoid overinterpretation. That single slide could delete a decade with a click. Students learned to pass labs by erasing the seam. Code inherited the lesson. Maps stayed smooth, ships didn't. Microstories kept the pulse alive. A data clerk microfilmed temporary guidance and shelved a duplicate under an older series where purges go to die. A Soviet colleague with a cigarette tap said wave and got asked not to say it in the joint write-up. A corrosion engineer scrawled O2 in a failure folder and crossed it out, then kept the dates anyway. A diver wrote edge breath again in a pocket notebook after smelling faint sulfur on off-axis basalt. None of them traded secrets. They just refused to throw away what their hands touched. The grad with the reels pulled one last quiet trick. He mailed a duplicate of 42 to himself, sealed, postmarked, never opened. Years later, after a long night with a crying baby, he slit it with a butter knife and cried at the hiss. The beat was still there. He hadn't captured glory, he'd captured time. Here's the tell that locked it for me. The fleet desk bent a training box around that rim for acoustic stability. The same weak POLYMODE labeled those spikes instrument error. If the meters lied, why did steel move? If Station 42 never happened, why did the helm slow on glass water? If the ocean was flat, why did insurance invent sensor events and cable chiefs wait to splice like surgeons watching a heart? The cruise didn't vanish. It was escorted into a drawer, laundered through a smoothing window, and replaced with a straight line that never sailed. The rim kept breathing. The paper track learned to hold its breath, and between them sat a cardboard box stamped practice that refused to forget. The Resource Gag, the Reroute pattern. While the lab learned to hold its breath, steel learned to flinch. Routes that used to run straight across the basin started growing elbows. Captains called them kinks. Planners called them efficiencies. Either way, the line curved right where the rim's clock beat loudest. You didn't need clearance to feel it. Public advisories bloomed as beige polygons. Training areas, system checks, calibration windows, always rotated just so, draped across the slope like tinted film. Radio chatter blamed weather, but the buoy logs read calm. Ships slid wide anyway, like they'd been warned the water itself might bite. Insurance smelled it first and translated breath into law. New riders slipped into hull and cable policies, quiet clauses about sensor events and transient signal environments. Not storms, sensors. If your route crossed the rim without a mitigation plan, your premium climbed. Sell a stability corridor that hugged the slow half of the beat and your rate got friendly. Underwriters don't argue philosophy, they price it. Navies never said oxygen out loud. They didn't have to. Notices carved boxes along oxygen minimum rims with bland codes and tidy dates. Inside, acousticians drilled crews on sensor shock events, propagation paths bending wrong during short excursions. Stability equals stealth. A pulsing boundary kills both. So they trained in silence, consortia learned in beige and left the textbooks to failure clusters nipped at the shoulder like teeth, always in runs that made no sense on a weather map. Internal memos sketched reroutes that looked like spaghetti, then circled short arcs labeled stability corridors. Repair ships loitered over flat seas, waiting out a window no forecast printed. When the beat eased, they spliced like surgeons and steamed home. Public reports blamed anchors. Deckhands blamed timing. Mining scouts moved like chess players who'd already seen the endgame. Lease filings stacked along shoulders, not centers. Prospectuses purred about enhanced boundary productivity and low-variance microenvironments. Euphemisms for sit near the metronome but not on it. Codings aged in dog years when you mistimed. Nodules likely grew in fits. Rigs scheduled work to dodge the bite. The only forbidden word was breath. Labs that tried to chase the rim ran headfirst into a smiling wall. Proposals praising boundary transients earned warm reviews and cold scores. Realigned scope, premature focus, risk to core objectives. The same week a naval box draped the slope for exercises. A program officer asked a PI to de-emphasize boundary events and nudged the crews 10 miles inland, close enough to smell the seam, too far to see it breathe. One indie consortium slipped through with fast sensors and burst sampling. 48 hours of gorgeous pulses, dead center on phase, then the bridge telex clattered. Suspend for security review. They steamed to the middle and took polite water. On land, a rival paper sponsored by Metal's money sailed a slow response sensor across the rim and declared serenity. Editors loved the calm. Students memorized it. Operators quietly ignored it. This is going to sound crazy, but the gag didn't need villains. It only needed alignment. Navies wanted stable sound. Cables wanted predictable chemistry. Miners wanted timed growth without timed rot. Insurers wanted clocks you could sell. 4 rooms, 4 budgets, 1 curve. The language harmonized by inertia. Instrument error in QA became sensor event in insurance. Training box in notices. Optimization in routing. Everyone pointed at a different noun and traced the same line. Are you sitting down? Because the cleanest tells live in timing. Lease bids rose right after advisory boxes expired. Insurance riders tightened right after clusters of sensor events. Mining DMOS splashed during quiet weeks, then went black through pulse windows. Cable lays waited out flat water because flat chemistry mattered more. That's not superstition. That's choreography. Micro-stories make it real. A London cable room, stale tea and tracing paper, 3 men over a chart. Delay 48 hours, one says. Internal activity likely. Weather turns out fine, the lay holds, the failure log stays blank. A bridge watch on a research ship slows 5 knots on glass water, writes ops, and keeps his mouth shut. A fisheries skipper whispers good pocket to a cousin, hauls heavy for 20 minutes, then ghosts back over the line. None of them say oxygen. They don't need to, they know the window. Behind the scenes, procurement learned new verbs. Coding specs called for resilience to short boundary excursions. Sonar RFPs demanded faster auto-recalibration in transient layers. Survey contracts required adaptive routing when sensors degrade. If you spoke that dialect, you were in the club. If you said breath on paper, you were not. University maps didn't budge. New atlases shaved the elbows clean. Lecture slides graded students for flattening blips. A QA training packet taught 3 bullets, flag jumps, smooth hard, avoid overinterpretation, and erased a decade with a smile. Out at sea, steel kept paying the toll on time. Look, I'm gonna tell you something plain. The resource gag isn't a memo, it's a habit. Rename the breath, price the window. Bend the route, smile for the press. Everyone keeps their lane and the public keeps the map. The result is 2 oceans, the one you can teach and the one you can sail. The human cost hides in trust. Captains fined for crossing dead lines that weren't dead. Students trained to erase Saudi, they'll spend careers dodging. Scientists told to harmonize, while repair chiefs watch telemetry like a heartbeat. You can hold the lie for only so long before the bill lands in hands with grease on them. Wait until you see what the bill looked like the week a line went black on a comm sea. The splice team waited for a window. A board said oxygen shock corrosion behind a locked door. A naval box flickered over the slope. That's the gag's punchline. They all knew the clock, they just never printed it. Countermoves, gags, and grants. While roots bent and premiums learned new adjectives, the labs walked into a smiling wall that called itself process. Calls for ship time went out. Proposals came back sharp. Fast sensors, burst sampling, sit on the rim and hold phase with internal waves. Reviewers praised rigor, then circled one phrase, boundary transients, and the scores slid. Realign scope. Premature focus. Risk to core objectives. Translation, study the center, not the edge. One crew tried playing nice. They rewrote everything with safe nouns, oxygen minimum, steady gradients, burying pulse in a footnote as potential artifacts. That version got approved, then a program officer phoned with a bright voice and a small knife. De-emphasize boundary events. The captain received a new track that missed the rim by 10 miles, close enough to smell the seam, too far to watch it breathe. Another lab went the other way, all in. Dual fast optodes, burst winklers, trace metals on microtimers, current meters sync to wave phase. A reviewer loved the ambition, then asked them to frame within conventional behavior and remove transient spikes likely caused by flow. The PI read it twice like it contained poison. The grad student laughed once and put her head down on the bench. A private foundation slid onto the field with glossy money and a gentle leash. The call said innovative boundary science. The term said align with industry needs. On a quiet call, they admitted they loved the plan as long as dead zones stayed dead in the final framing. Study edge dynamics, fine, just don't let oxygen pop on a chart. The team passed, their neighbors didn't. One small consortium squeezed through with a patchwork of ship days and stubborn timing. They set sensors to burst mode and nailed the internal wave crest. The first day lit like a metronome, 3 up, 10 down, clean, repeatable, honest. 48 hours later, the telex hammered. Suspend operations for security review. Hold position pending guidance. They steamed to the middle and spent 6 days sampling polite water. Back on land, the grant calendars turned beige. Panels asked for harmonization with consensus figures and prioritize interpretability. You could park a freighter through those phrases and still miss the rim by 10 miles. One group fought back with deck logs, trace metal spikes, and mooring phase. The reply warned that further fieldwork in those coordinates might raise clearance implications. That phrase follows you like a shadow. Then came the clean, no pulses paper, fast-tracked and sponsor-approved, slow response sensor. Blurred changes under 10 minutes. A figure you'd hang in a lobby. The abstract claimed stability, the methods bragged low noise. Metals money in the acknowledgments. Editors loved the certainty. Students learned it cold. A calibration tech, the kind who can fix a sensor blindfolded, posted a quiet note. No drama, just response time curves and phase lags. He overlaid the slow ear on the fast ear. The 3-minute breath flattened into politeness. A sundial won't time a hummingbird. He never named a rival, he didn't have to. Scientists started tucking the real story into corners. Preprints went up with stacked profiles and tiny legends that only stubborn readers decode. Conference talks saved the breath for the last 2 slides, the ones you show if the chair lets you run long. A working group drafted a protocol, dual sensors, public raw archives, no smoothing before release, phase tags required. It died in committee when someone said harmonize with established standards. Training packets did the blunt work. A blue cover, 3 bullets, flag jumps as likely artifacts, apply standardized smoothing, avoid overinterpretation of short-lived features. That slide traveled faster than any paper. It turned artifact into muscle memory. Here S where the mask slipped. The debunked team, confident, ran a side experiment with a faster package to characterize noise. One night on the rim, the instrument heard the drum, loud and regular. Their internal memo said short boundary excursions. Their public paper still said stable, citing themselves. The kink on the chart grew a cousin. A tiny grant with no industry ties slipped to a young crew with stubborn hearts. They camped a week on the shoulder, logged the breath live, and matched Fisher's 20-minute pockets to phase. The reviewers tried for 2 years to call it artifacts. The team refused, welded their verbs to the data, and survived reviewer 2 by texting photos of the beat like baby pictures. Half the spikes died in supplementary, but the main figure inhaled on the page. Meanwhile, procurement learned new words that never touched journals. Coding specs, resilient to short boundary excursions. Array upgrades, faster auto-recalibration in transient layers. Survey contracts, adaptive routing in sensor-challenging environments. If you spoke that dialect, you got funded. If you said breath out loud, you got brunch with a polite no. Microstories held the line. A clerk microfilmed temporary guidance without accession numbers and shelved a duplicate under an older series nobody purges. A modeler made a hidden folder called Breath and dumped unsmoothed casts with phase tags and Do Not Bin. A captain got a midnight telex to steer 10 miles off a slope he could trace blind, and he didn't ask why. A corrosion engineer slipped a slide to a friend, oxygen shock events, failure clusters on the rim, and walked away. Look, I'm gonna tell you something plain. The gags worked because they were boring. Beige calls, friendly notes, slides with bullets. Each one shaved a tooth, each one moved a ship. And while the paperwork smiled, a repair chief on a COM-C watched telemetry for a window no textbook admits exists, waiting to splice only when the rim exhaled. The model breaks. Look, I'm gonna tell you something simple and ugly. The ocean didn't fail, the code did. Back on shore, the pipeline that turns raw casts into clean profiles did what it was trained to do. It saw the rim inhale for 3 minutes and called it misbehavior. Outliers, smooth it, bin it, smile. The figure came out polite, the truth did not. Assimilation made it worse. That step is supposed to let reality nudge the forecast. Instead, the background field scolded the data. It flagged the breath as inconsistent, which is code for make the ocean match the map. A junior analyst, eyes red from late nights, whispered that the system was rejecting the heartbeat. His boss said the filter was protecting the field. Protecting what exactly? Clarity or a promise that never belonged to water? You could taste the crack in carbon first. In low-oxygen water, decomposition crawls. Give it a breath and it sprints, dumping CO2 in quick bursts before slamming the brakes. One breath is small. A coastline of them clocked by internal waves is policy grade. Export curves grew sawteeth. The pipeline sanded them flat. Budgets looked calm again. Someone wrote hiccups manageable on a board and went to lunch. Fisheries snapped next, and this is where the paper cuts flesh. Closures drew fat, straight lines across maps that still taught deserts. Catch logs, greasy, handwritten, honest, lit along the rim exactly when the breath said they would. Crews hauled heavy for 20 minutes, then dead again. The patrol boat didn't care about phase, it cared about ink. Fines landed, trust bled. A captain said, maps are jail. A manager said, maps are guidance. The room went quiet and stayed that way. The modeler who'd built half that pipeline stared at a cast the filters had repaired. The shoulder was gorgeous. It was also fake. He toggled the smoothing off. The tooth jumped back like a guilty secret. He remembered the moorings' clean beat and the manganese's quick hands. He turned the filter on again and watched the breath die. He didn't throw a chair. He just pushed back and let the silence do the work. Meanwhile at sea, procedures were quietly changing without permission slips. A repair chief watched telemetry for the window before splicing because the sheath aged years in a pulse. A survey captain drifted 10 minutes off the slope on a calm day and called it ops. A sonar team doubled recalibration speed inside a beige box labeled training. None of that lived in the model. All of it lived in the world. Here's the pivot. The team stripped the pipeline to the studs. No eager outlier bins, no default smoothing. Burst sampling kept its teeth. They phased casts to the internal wave, not to a calendar. They logged winklers in the exact window the mooring sang. They tagged currents with the same beat. The rim inhaled on screen, not a rumor, not a ghost, a schedule. Then they did something bolder. They paired the breath to humans. A skipper texted timestamps of heavy totes. A deckhand's photo showed birds stacking over the edge. The peaks aligned. A corrosion engineer slid a private histogram across a coffee table, failure clusters marching in the same rhythm. The room didn't cheer, it exhaled. The code learned new manners. Transient got a new tag, phase-locked boundary event. Filters defaulted to warn, not erase. Archives kept unsmoothed casts by rule. Phase windows rode in the metadata. A student toggled see breath and watched the atlas grow a pulse. She didn't post a thread. She emailed a clerk, a captain, and a coder. What nobody said out loud was the part that hurt most. The pipeline had been faithful to a textbook that lied by habit. Protect clarity, punish teeth. That creed built careers, smoothed figures, and bought calm meetings. It also kited bills to people who splice in weather that doesn't exist. Trust me, you're not ready for the first public break. A regional forecast missed a respiration swing. The surface code 2 buoys caught it. The fishery window landed on the wrong week. Complaints climbed the chain. An erratum slid out in soft language about short-lived boundary heterogeneity. Not breath, not yet. But the code no longer snapped the ruler first. They hadn't solved the ocean. They'd stopped sanding it. The rim still inhaled on a clock. The model finally let it. And once you hear that beat in a plot, you can't unhear it at sea. The next cast wasn't cleaner. It was honest. And that was the moment the story flipped from defense to proof. The textbook scrub. Look, I'm gonna tell you something simple that hurts. Printers finished what memos started. The sea breathed on a clock, but the page taught students it didn't. Early drafts in the late 70s still had teeth, thin spikes at the rim, captions full of careful verbs like possible episodic oxygenation. Then committee season arrived. QA packets blessed 3 safe bullets, flag jumps, smooth hard, avoid overinterpretation. Editors love consensus. Overnight, temporary guidance turned into policy. A senior author sent in a chapter with the tooth showing. In proofs, the spike looked like a clean bite. In print, the axis stretched, the tooth rounded, and the caption swapped episodic for localized. Localized is how you bury a clock without saying you did. Students met that figure first, not the deck logs, so their reflex became automatic. If it twitches at the boundary, it's wrong. Slides did the blunt work. A friendly blue title, Best Practices for OMZ Boundaries. Bullet 1, High Oxygen Jumps Likely Artifacts. Bullet 2, Apply Standardized Smoothing. Bullet 3, Avoid Overinterpretation of Short-Lived Features. You can hear the good intent, don't get fooled by noise, but the habit it built was worse than noise. It taught smart people to erase the seam before they ever saw it. Curriculum writers copied the slides like scripture. Lab assignments graded you on how clean your curve looked, not on whether it matched a living ocean. If you left a blip in, you got a red pen. Check calibration. Code arrived pre-trained by those pages. Default filters mirrored the bullets. Outlier bins learned to hum along. The pipeline didn't misbehave, it obeyed. Meanwhile, librarians were fighting a quiet little war in basements that smell like dust and toner. A microfilm reel from one campus still flashed the boundary tooth. The updated reel across the country showed a polite shoulder. Errata pages fixed typos, never axes. Temporary QA notes slipped into meeting minutes without accession numbers, which means they never had to be retracted. It wasn't a bonfire. It was a caption change with a very long tail. Editors defended the scrub with reasons that sound sane. Readers need comparability. Don't let one cruise rewrite the canon. Keep figures clear. Clarity became a code word for flat. When an author pushed back, clean doesn't exist at the rim, the answer came back in soft type. Our readership prefers clarity. The messy plot slid into supplementary, which is the graveyard where good data goes to be respectable. Here's a micro story that tells you everything. A lecturer held up 2 atlases, Draft 1978, Edition 1982. He joked it was the same ocean. A student in the back squinted and asked why the rim stopped twitching. The room laughed. The lecturer said they learned to measure better. He taught the wrong lesson very well. 20 people left with a reflex to trust the shoulder more than the ship. What nobody saw was how that reflex hard-coded itself into tools. Textbooks shaped defaults. Defaults shaped pipelines. Pipelines shaped maps. A young modeler fresh out of class wrote auto-smooth transients because that's how you pass oral exams. Years later, she sat in a dim room, toggled the filter off, and watched the rim inhale on screen. She didn't write a manifesto. She emailed a captain and a clerk and asked for the reel with the tooth. Meanwhile, other buildings were already speaking the ocean's dialect in plain terms the journals never printed. A corrosion seminar taught oxygen shock events near boundaries. A sonar brief trained crews for sensor shock inside beige boxes. Procurement specs asked for coatings resilient to short boundary excursions. 3 rooms, same clock, no citations. The textbooks trained you to erase the breath. The operators trained to dodge it. Then came the satellite era like a backlight. Early ocean color picked up surface slicks marching with internal waves. Gliders rode the slope and logged oxygen flickers on the same beat the moorings sang. Students raised on shoulders opened those feeds and watched Saudi they'd been graded to delete. Some called tech support. Others called their mothers. A few called the archive and asked for station numbers that didn't exist between 41 and 43. Are you sitting down? Because the scrub even crept into how we talk about being wrong. A review would say frame within conventional behavior. Authors would add a hedge. Features may reflect flow artifacts. That one sentence got cited more than the figure that showed the breath. The hedge became scripture. Scripture became software. Software flattened a living seam. Microstories keep this human. A reviewer penciled destabilizes boundary depiction, omit beside a tiny twitch, then scribbled save this. He couldn't print the breath, but he couldn't kill it. A clerk microfilmed temporary guidance that never got a number and shelved a duplicate under an older series nobody purges. A calibration tech drew 2 response curves, fast ear, slow ear, showing how a 3-minute breath becomes a shoulder if your sensor is lazy. He didn't accuse. He just graphed the loss. Look, here's the hinge. The textbook scrub didn't invent malice. It rewarded tidy. Tidy built careers, passed classes, soothed panels, and starved truth. The price landed offshore in fines, in failed splices, in rigs that aged in dog years. The fix isn't heroic, it's boring. Print the tooth, tag the phase, keep raw casts public. Teach, warn, don't erase. Let code inherit skepticism instead of certainty. Trust me, you're not ready for how fast a map changes once a single plate grows a pulse. Students stop red penning breaths. Reviewers stop asking for shoulders. Pipelines stop snapping rulers. And ships, this is the tell, stop drawing elbows no textbook admits are there. The scrub flattened a world. We're putting the rib back in the chest so the ocean can breathe on the page like it does in the dark. The reversal buried proof in plain sight. Look, I'm gonna tell you something that's going to sound crazy, but the breath we weren't allowed to print kept resurfacing where nobody thought to look. In hardware fixes, dull specs, and ledgers that don't care about consensus. While textbooks flattened the rim, other rooms quietly wrote solutions for a problem that didn't exist. First tell engineering paper trails. A corrosion team working for a cable consortium filed an adaptive coating design aimed at short-lived oxygen spikes that trigger rapid pitting. They didn't call it poetry. They called it survivability during short boundary excursions. That phrase shows up in test rigs, not in journals. You don't spec a fix unless you've met the problem at sea. They weren't arguing theory. They were buying uptime. Meanwhile, fisheries logs told the same beat, just with gills. Boats that hugged the shoulder of a closure line tagged 20-minute windows when nets came up heavy, then dead. Skippers didn't say oxygen. They said the edge woke up, and they timed coffee to the bite. Those timestamps lined up with internal wave periods like teeth on a gear. Regulators shrugged. Crews paid their fuel bills and kept their mouths shut. Are you sitting down? because training notes in another building used the same dialect. Post-famous acoustics briefs warned teams to expect sensor shock events near boundary layers, not storms. Sensors, practical guidance, recalibrate faster inside those boxes, anticipate sudden path flips, don't trust yesterday's propagation. Again, no chemistry, just a fix for a clock the textbook said wasn't there. Then satellites and gliders lit the floor from above and below. Early ocean color didn't see oxygen, but it saw surface slicks marching with internal waves, dark, combed bands sweeping downslope. Decades later, gliders riding the same edges logged oxygen flickers in perfect step with those slicks. Surface ghosts, subsurface breath. 2 instruments, 1 drum. The metronome that hid on reel 42 now pulsed across whole basins. Behind the scenes, procurement specs started harmonizing with that drum like it was a standard key. Naval corrosion test matrices added short boundary excursions as a baseline condition. Cable tenders asked for coatings resilient to episodic oxygenation without spelling out a single cast. Sonar upgrades demanded faster autorecal when transient layers tripped array logic. 3 rooms, same window. The public never learned the word. The steel learned the habit. Micro story time. A cable engineer and a windbreaker stood over a length of sheath that looked a decade older than last week. Calm seas, no trawlers, no storm front. He traced failure dates with a blunt finger and muttered, "Something took a bite when no one was looking." In his briefcase sat a tender line item for coatings rated for short boundary excursions. He didn't know a grad student had once taped that beat to a bulkhead with gray tape. He did know when to wait before splicing. Here's where the receipts start to rhyme. Satellite fronts arched over old cruise tracks where station numbers were missing. Slicks marched right across the coordinates the helm slowed on, the week the fleet bent a training box for acoustic stability. Analysts stitched those slick maps to glider oxygen and watched the pulses crawl up the slope like ants on a seam. Somebody finally overlaid advisory polygons, lease dates, and failure logs. The room didn't clap, it just got very quiet. A second micro story, tighter. A diver from the famous orbit, hands like rope, memory like a tide, pulled a pocket notebook from a drawer. 1 line, edge breath again. He'd swum off Axis basalt that wore faint, frosting white mats nowhere near a smoker. He remembered a soft sulfur nose and a cold lip shift like a whisper. He didn't speak the code, he felt the clock. And the phrase kept showing up where it mattered most, in boring success. Cable rooms delayed lays 48 hours over glass water and logged 0 failures. Arrays doubled recal speeds inside beige boxes and cut false alarms in half. Coatings that survived short boundary excursions lasted a planned season longer. None of those wins lived in a figure caption. All of them lived on invoices. Trust me, you're not ready for the neat stack when you lay it on the same table. Tapes labeled practice. A QA memo renaming breath as artifact. A helm log kink on a calm day. A naval notice draped for stability. A corrosion spec short boundary excursions. Fish totes heavy on a clock. Satellite slicks marching with waves. Gliders flickering in phase. It stops feeling like coincidence. It starts reading like choreography. So what's the reversal? It's not that the breath finally appeared. It's that it never left. Operators solved it silently because they had to, while the page kept smoothing it to keep the canon clean. The ocean wrote timing into steel and catch logs. The labs taught students to delete it. And yet every time the rim inhaled, someone somewhere adjusted, rerouted, delayed, recalibrated, waited. They voted with fuel, with schedules, with repairs. Here's the kicker. A standards draft for cable protection quietly required testing under short boundary oxygenation excursions. The cosigner, a name that once penciled destabilizes boundary depiction, omit beside a twitch in a chapter draft. Same hand, different building. He wouldn't print the breath for students. He demanded it for steel. This rabbit hole goes deeper because the proof wasn't hiding in shadows. It was filed as routine. The metronome lived in patents, tenders, notices, logs, and slides with no drama at all. And once you see that, you stop asking whether the rim breathes. You start asking who priced it, who timed it, and who still pretends the map is flat. False ending 1, so what right? So what right? It's a 3-minute blip on a graph. Cute deck drama, who cares? Here's why you should. Every kink in a shipping lane burns cash. Add 10 miles to thousands of voyages because a beige box told captains to arc wide, and you're lighting money on fire. Fuel, crew hours, port slots, gone. That cost doesn't vanish. It slides into freight, groceries, the stuff you buy without knowing you paid a pulse tax to an ocean your atlas said was calm. Cables pay faster. A bad splice in the window costs a ship day, a second splice, and lost capacity nobody refunds. When a chief waits 6 hours on glass water for telemetry to settle, that's payroll, diesel, and insurance ticking. If codings age in dog years during the breath, you're pulling steel early, filing claims, and eating deductibles you priced as sensor events because you weren't allowed to say oxygen. Mining, that's the riskiest bet in the room. Nodules don't grow like paint, they accrete in fits, and that fit rides chemistry. If you park a sled on the wrong shoulder or time a pilot, you chew the dead half and erode the live half. Coatings pit, hydraulics sulk, microbes wake, and your low-impact demo turns into a maintenance film. Investors call it operational variability. Translation, we guessed the clock and paid for it. Climate isn't spared. Export models tuned for seasons miss sprints. Decomposers crawl in low O2, then run during the breath. Multiply 3-minute runs along 1,000 kilometers of rim, and your carbon ledger wobbles enough to move targets, credits, and hedges. When assimilation bins the sawteeth as noise, we're not forecasting, we're comforting ourselves. Fisheries bleed last and loudest. Closure lines drawn with fat pens skip the only spots still breathing. Crews burn diesel over certified deserts while 20 minutes away the rim wakes and pays rent. Land on the wrong side of ink, you eat a fine. Land inside the window, you pay the mortgage. Management calls it compliance. Wheelhouses call it Tuesday. This rabbit hole goes deeper because everybody already prices the breath. Navies route stealth around it. Cables sell stability corridors. Miners file leases on shoulders. Insurers invent exclusions for transient signal environments. 4 rooms, 1 drum. The public map stays polite while private calendars move on phase. Timing is the tell. Lease bids spike right after advisories fade. Repair ships loiter then sprint when the metronome eases. Demos brag in quiet weeks and go dark in pulse windows. That's choreography. Someone hears the beat. Someone else pays for not hearing it. And trust is the cleanest cost. Captains stop believing charts that find them for being right. Students stop trusting slides once a glider shows teeth. Scientists stop trusting panels that worship clarity over truth. Talent leaves, habits harden, bills land offshore anyway. So no, it's not a cute anomaly. It's a live wire that taxes your food, your freight, your weather bets. The breath already runs the market. Who benefited? The only question left is whether the map you use can breathe. Look, I'm gonna tell you something plain. Once you hear the beat, you can see who moved to it. You don't need a smoking memo. You need a calendar, a chart, and a pencil. First up, navies. After the famous years, training notes started flagging sensor shock events near boundary rims. Publicly, they posted bland boxes with alphanumeric codes. Privately, acousticians drilled crews to expect sudden path flips and recalibrate fast. Stability equals stealth, and a pulsing rim murders stability. So they bought silence with timing, exercises on the shoulder, curtains over the seam, and never a single chemistry word on paper. When academic figures stayed smooth, that was convenient, not decisive. They were already teaching the fix. Cables learned it with invoices. Failure clusters nipped the slope like teeth, and internal maps sprouted spaghetti routes no brochure would ever show. Underwriters slipped in exclusions for sensor events, and suddenly stability corridor became the phrase that paid. Repair ships loitered over glass water, waiting for a window the weather didn't print. Splice in the trough, not the crest. Make it home on time. Every good month confirmed the rule. Every bad splice paid for the lesson again. Miners moved like chess players who knew the endgame. Leases stacked on shoulders, not centers. Prospectuses sold enhanced boundary productivity, code for sit near the breath without letting it chew your gear. Coatings aged in dog years if you miss time to pilot. Hydraulics sulked, microbes woke, cameras fogged from chemistry alone. So they sequenced work to dodge the upbeat and bragged during quiet weeks. Demos vanished when the metronome got loud. Investors saw discipline. Engineers saw self-preservation. Insurers turned the cadence into math. Premiums spiked when routes crossed live rims without mitigation. They softened when operators could show phase awareness. Nobody wrote oxygen in a writer. They didn't have to. They wrote transient signal environments and watched the market sort believers from amateurs. If your plan counted minutes and slopes, you got a nod. If you hid behind seasonal averages, you paid. Here S where the 3 rooms overlap. Picture an arc of seafloor where a cable corridor grazes a naval box and a pilot rig sits inside a survey polygon. Same week, a line goes black on a calm night, arrays report shock, and the rig files a dull, unanticipated transients note. Public story, weather variability. Desk story, wait for the window next time. That's not conspiracy, that's choreography with polite nouns. Micro story, London, late afternoon. Stale tea, tracing paper, 3 men bent over a chart. Delay 48 hours, one says, circling the slope. Internal activity likely. Forecast shows fair, finance scowls, ops shrugs, they wait anyway. The lay holds, the log stays quiet, and the meeting never makes minutes. Across town, a sonar tech updates a checklist. Double recal inside box H7. Same tide, different acronyms, one drum. Are you sitting down? Because the timing tells on everyone. Lease bids jump right after advisory boxes expire. Insurance updates trail clusters of sensor events by 1/4 like clockwork. Route elbows fade in public brochures the same month premiums fall, because now the corridor is stable. It's a market built on map arbitrage. The public chart is polite, the private chart breathes, and the spread is profit. And the labs, they weren't in the club. When they wrote episodic oxygenation, the beige phone rang. When they scrubbed the spike, ship time appeared. The quiet cartel never needed to muzzle every paper. It just needed to price the truth faster than professors could print it. Procurement sealed the dialect. Coding tests withstand short boundary excursions. Array tenders, faster auto-recal in transient layers. Survey contracts. Adaptive routing capability where sensors degrade. If you spoke those lines, doors opened. If you wrote breath in a grant, a chipper email suggested portfolio balance and a track 10 miles inland. Human tells don't lie. A repair chief stares at pitted sheath like it aged a decade by lunch and mutters, not splicing on a crest. A naval watch logs 2 recal cycles in 20 minutes and writes nothing cheeky. A rig boss shifts a dive by 6 hours with no announcement. A fisheries captain scribbles good pocket on a dead map and calls only his cousin. 4 jobs, 4 budgets, same clock. Look, this rabbit hole goes deeper because the cartel didn't need meetings, it needed habits. Rename the breath, block the rim. Bend the line, bill the timing, teach fixes, not causes. Keep the academy tidy and the invoices quiet. If you learned the clock, you saved money. If you trusted the shoulder in a textbook, you paid it. So who benefited? The people who could hear the drum before the ink did. Navies bought stealth by training to silence. Cables sold reliability by hugging the slow half. Miners banked growth and dodged rot by straddling the edge. Insurers minted discipline by rewarding timing and punishing denial. Who paid? Anyone sailing the smooth map, students, small operators, captains fined for being right too soon. Trust me, you're not ready for the spot where all 3 interests physically stack. A cable arc, a naval box, a pilot frame, same slope, same week. A splice waits, an array recalibrates, a dive delays. On paper, nothing happened. On deck, everyone obeyed the same window. The quiet cartel wasn't a cabal, it was a metronome and a choice to never print the song. Climax, the cut line. While the route elbows multiplied on glossy charts, one calm week wrote the truth in steel. A deep-sea cable crossed an empty patch near the rim, no storms, no trawlers, no excuses. 3 days later, the signal stuttered, then died. Public bulletins blamed adverse conditions. The sea state log said glass. The cut line didn't care what the paperwork preferred. The repair ship steamed out with that quiet dread crews get on jobs that punish shortcuts. On deck, the supervisor tapped a grease pencil on the elbow they'd drawn on purpose weeks earlier. He said, "There," like the word could move the seam. Grapnels bit, the winch sang, and the black sheath came up looking 10 years older than last Tuesday. Not torn, pitted, freckled, tired, like something had taken a bite when nobody was looking. Behind a door with a polite acronym, a board met and minced words into confetti. Most of the transcript was blacked out, but one phrase slipped through. Oxygen shock corrosion. Not anchor damage, not weather. Oxygen shock corrosion. The same dialect procurement had been whispering for years, finally written in a room that files claims. Back on deck, the chief did the thing that tells you who actually runs this story. He didn't splice right away. He watched telemetry, the line's faint heartbeat on a green screen like a surgeon waiting for a patient to steady. Hold, he said, even as the water lay flat as glass around them. They burned hours in silence because the rim was inhaling, and if you join steel on a crest, you pay twice. When the trace eased, he nodded. The splice was fast, practiced, almost tender. The signal flickered back, steadied, held. Publicly, the post-mortem conjured a pressure system that never formed. Insurance copied the phrasing like always. The press got 3 sentences. Operators got a note they actually needed. Don't touch steel when the edge breathes. New slang, same clock. Unknown to the deckhands, a naval box flickered over the same slope that week. A beige rectangle with codes that mean don't ask. Inside, sonar teams logged sensor shock events and doubled recalibration speed. 2 buildings, no shared memos, 1 schedule. The Ocean wrote timing into both rooms and waited for neither to admit it. Micro story from the rail. A rigger lit a cigarette, leaned over the pitted sheath and said it looked like rust in time lapsed. The engineer beside him muttered, "Breathe now, bite now," caught himself and shut up. You don't say breath on a work order. You say transient event and keep your job, but the hands felt the word anyway. Here's the hinge. That failure sat inside a pulse window that the old mooring had clocked years earlier. The splice waited out a trough you can now see in satellite slicks marching over the slope. And the board minutes used shock the same way a diver from the famous orbit once wrote "edge breath again" in a pocket notebook. 3 rooms, same drum. No accident required. Look, I'm gonna tell you something plain. The Ocean writes truth in timing. If steel fails on the breath and holds off it, that's not a glitch. It's a test you just ran. Roots kink around the seam because invoices taught them to. Labs smooth the spike because committees taught them to. Navies trained to recal fast and say nothing. Insurers priced the window and invented beige nouns to keep the peace. Everyone behaved like the rim was alive. Nobody printed the word. You can feel the human cost stacked on that table. A captain fined last month for crossing a dead line watched birds stack over the rim that same afternoon. 20 minutes of heavy totes, then silence. He kept the coordinates in his head and the anger in his gut. A student raised on shoulders stared at a glider feed and toggled the filter off. Sawteeth jumped out. She whispered, "Oh." A coder added a tag, phase-locked boundary event, to a pipeline that used to write outlier. He didn't ask permission. He renamed survival. Are you sitting down? Because the cleanest proof wasn't the pit or the splice. It was the weight. On a flat sea with payroll ticking and a supervisor breathing down his neck, the chief held for a window no forecast printed. He obeyed the Ocean's clock, not the atlas. That pause is the confession. That pause says everybody who matters already knows the rim inhales. The aftermath slid into quiet updates. Coding specs added short boundary excursions to baseline tests. Route planners sold stability corridors like upgrades. Notices draped the shoulder with new letters and calm fonts. The next press release used the word resilience 3 times. The next textbook still drew the desert flat. Trust me, you're not ready for how simple the conclusion is. The cut line didn't break a cable. It broke the last excuse. If the breath is artifact, why did steel age in minutes and paperwork wait for the trough? If Station 42 never happened, why did the helm slow on glass water? If dead zones don't breathe, why does every fix ride a schedule? The Ocean doesn't care what you call a seam. It inhales anyway. The only question left is whether the map you trust can keep time. Aftermath, today's stakes. Look, I'm gonna tell you something plain. The breath never stopped. We just built whole systems that pretend not to hear it. And now the bill is landing in real time, on rigs, on routes, on quotas, on climate bets that crack if you count minutes instead of seasons. Deep-sea mining is stepping straight onto the wire. New blocks sit right on the rims we've been tiptoeing around for 40 years. On glossy PDFs, they're low-impact, data-rich rectangles. In the water, they're chemical seams that flip fast. Park a sled there, stir the skin, and you goose the pulse. Wake microbes that eat steel, spike corrosion rates, cloud sensors, and turn a pilot into a maintenance sprint. Coatings that last a year in comm chemistry can age a season in a loud week. Operators won't write oxygen in reports, but they'll buy downtime they didn't budget for. Fisheries know this beat in their bones, and they pay for the map's pride. Straight closures slice across edges that breathe on a clock. Crews burn diesel over certified deserts while 20 minutes away, birds stack and the rim wakes like it always does. The official story says stocks collapsed everywhere. Wheelhouses say hold your nerve for one window and you can pay the mortgage. That mismatch breeds fines, anger, and empty harbors. Fix the line with a thin pen that curves to the clock, and suddenly Tuesday pays again. Climate is the quietest wound because the error looks tidy. Models tuned for slow seasons sand off the sawteeth. But decomposers sprint during the breath and code 2 jumps in bursts before slamming the brakes. One pulse is small, a coastline of them moves ledgers. Credits, hedges, targets, each leans on a map that forgot to breathe. Assimilation still bins transients like graffiti while gliders trace the flicker live. We're comforting ourselves with shoulders while the rim exhales on a schedule. Meanwhile, the operator stopped waiting for permission. Gliders ride the slope with fast optodes and send back metronomes you can set a watch to. Moorings run burst modes and survive the beat. Surface slicks comb across satellite frames in step with the deep. Cable planners advertise stability corridors that hug the slow half of the drum. Coding specs quietly demand resilience to short boundary excursions. Navy arrays practice autorecal in sensor shock boxes like it's muscle memory. Everyone with steel on the line treats the rim like a live wire. The only place it stays flat is the page. So the choice is ugly and simple. Either we correct the map or we keep paying the pulse tax in silence. Correcting it means yanking 3 bullets out of 1,000 decks. Flag jumps? Good. Flag and tag phase, don't erase. Standard smoothing? Fine. Warn first, preserve raw casts, archive unsanded. Avoid overinterpretation. Sure, pair breath to internal wave phase and independent chemistry before you name it. And then do the expensive, boring part. Grant ship days to sit on the shoulder and hold the clock. Draw fishery lines that curve. Tune models to see sprints without swallowing the ocean in noise. Teach students to toggle the filter off and listen. If we double down on tidy, the sea will keep the score anyway. More elbows in routes. More sensor events in riders. More pilots turning into corrosion workshops. Another class graded for deleting the thing they'll spend a career dodging. We keep the peace on paper. The water sends invoices. Micro stories tell you how a fix starts. A young analyst watches a glider saw tooth up a slope and toggles smoothing off. The beat gets loud. She overlays a static closure and watches it slice through the peaks. She doesn't post a thread. She emails 3 people, a captain who works that edge, a coder who can add a phase tag, and a clerk who knows which drawer hides reels stamped practice. Can we align these? She writes. That's how a map learns to breathe. Behind the scenes, little tweaks ripple fast. QA packets swap artifact for phase-locked event. Repositories require an unsmoothed file. Reviewers stop asking for shoulders and ask for timing evidence. A fisheries meeting trials a curved window once a week, 20 minutes long, and boats come home with quiet halls and calmer radios. A model release notes, transient boundary handling changed from reject to warn, phase metadata required. Nobody rings a bell. The steel notices. Are you sitting down? Because the last truth is boring and beautiful. We don't need heroes. We need habits. Post raw casts before filters bite. Phase tag the rim. Crosslink glider beats with nets, with moorings, with failure logs. Teach sea breath as a butt, not a scandal. The ocean isn't asking us to worship chaos. It's asking us to keep time. Once you hear the drum, you can't unhear it. Routes bend less. Fines fall. Pilots stop bleeding. Carbon budgets wobble honestly and then steady. And the Atlas finally draws a rib where a rib belongs, so the sea can breathe on the page the way it always has in the dark. The ones who spoke up. Look, I'm gonna tell you something plain. This didn't survive because a hero kicked down a door. It survived because careful people refused to throw away what their hands touched. Start with the marine tech who hated empty drawers. When the practice reels were ordered off the books, he did what quiet pros do. He duplicated everything, logged the copies, and mailed one to himself sealed, postmarked, never opened. He labeled the shoebox TOOLS so nobody would snoop. Years later, middle of the night, baby crying in the next room, he slit that envelope with a butter knife. The hiss rolled out, the clock beat rose, and a grown man cried over tape because time finally spoke back. Across a hallway, a reviewer penciled himself into a corner. On a draft with a tiny tooth at the rim, he wrote, "Destabilizes boundary depiction, MIT." 2 lines down, he underlined the figure and scribbled, "Save this." He couldn't print the breath. He couldn't kill it either. That draft slid into a file, then into a cabinet, then into a basement that smells like dust and toner. Years later, a student chasing a rumor found both sentences and realized one person had argued with himself on our behalf. A clerk, there's always one, saw beige memos labeled temporary guidance with no accession numbers. She microfilmed them anyway, tagged them with working call numbers, and quietly shelved a duplicate under an older series nobody purges. She wasn't making a stand. She was doing her job too well for a lie to take root. That one duplicate is why one library's reel still flashes the tooth everyone else lost. Then you've got the calibration tech, sleeves rolled, who knows sensors like family. He drew 2 curves on one page, fast ear, slow ear, and let the math do the talking. A 3-minute breath vanished under the slow response. Same cast, same water, 2 instruments, 2 worlds. He didn't call out names. He just taped the curve above the bench where people grab coffee. A cable engineer windbreaker, same jacket in every photo, kept a thin folder stamped failures. Dates, coordinates, pitted sheaths. In the margin, 02, crossed out because it wasn't his lane. He logged the clusters anyway. He didn't need the word, he needed the fix. He delayed lays by hours on glass water because the rim was loud even if the weather was. A diver from the famous orbit, hands like rope, memory like tide, kept a pocket notebook. One line, edge breath again. Off-axis basalt, frosting white mats, soft sulfur, a cold lip shift. He didn't argue chemistry. He logged a feeling that matched a metronome he never saw. There was a modeler born into shoulders who made a hidden folder called breath on a shared drive. He dumped unsmoothed casts in it, tagged wave phase, wrote do not bin, and locked the permissions. When a supervisor asked why, he said, because the ocean doesn't care what our window is. He kept his job because the plots he saved were the only ones that lined up with failure clocks and heavy totes. Micro-stories braided into a chain. A fisheries skipper, sick of fines for crossing dead lines, started texting timestamp photos of heavy hauls to a grad student he trusted. No coordinates, nobodies that naive, just times, birds, and a note about weather. The student overlaid the shots on internal wave phase and watched the peaks kiss the photos. He slid a printout under a regulator's door with 3 words, make closures breathe. A retiring grant officer found a box labeled QA variances, clearance implications on the first line. He almost tossed it. Instead, he mailed it to the only university he knew still ran a working microfilm reader. No speech, no thread, just a blue pen and a forwarding address. That box bridged a committee room and a student threading reel 42 on a Tuesday. A librarian who knew which drawer sticks taught a junior how to spot updated atlases that quietly stretched axes. They printed both pages, taped them side by side, tooth versus shoulder, and made a habit of showing anyone who'd listen. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, she'd say, and then point to the kink in a public cruise track that was never supposed to bend. A QA trainer off script at the end of a long day added one unsanctioned line beneath those 3 bullets. Flag jumps, smooth standard, avoid overinterpretation. Then he said, warn, don't erase. He caught himself, clicked to the next slide, and hoped 2 people in the room would remember. A coder pushed a tiny update. Phase-locked boundary event as a tag default filter from erase to warn. Release notes read boring. The impact was, the next student toggled see breath and watched a flat atlas grow a rib. Look, I'm gonna tell you something. The breath survived because ordinary stubbornness beat polite consensus. Tapes, reels, pencils, microfilm, pocket notebooks, junk drawer folders, late-night emails, and a quiet folder named breath, none of it glamorous, all of it decisive. These people didn't see themselves as brave, they saw themselves as accurate. And once their crumbs met the new eyes, the glider feeds, the satellite slicks, the moorings that sang, you had crosschecks in stereo. A taped spike matched a splice delay. A penciled save this matched a procurement spec. A diver's edge breath again matched a bird's over rim photo and a 20-minute haul. Trust me, you're not ready for how simple the last link feels. A young analyst, smooth atlas on her lap, glider sawteeth on her screen, emails 3 names, a captain, a coder, a clerk. Can we align these? The captain replies with a time. The coder adds a tag. The clerk sends a real number. That's it. That's how the map learns to breathe. That edge breath flips steel, quotas, and carbon because minutes at the rim can rewrite years on the books. If this hit you in the gut, subscribe and watch the follow-up I pinned, names, memos, and fixes you can use. Share this with the one person on your crew who still trusts the flat map over the rough water, and let's make the chart keep time.